Chapter 9. Why Should My Heart Be Sad? Sirius didn't sleep all night. He'd left the church, lingering outside until he watched Father Albus pull the larger front doors shut, the click of a lock echoing into the empty street. Even then, he hadn't gone directly home. For a long time, he sat on the pavement, sending text after fruitless text to Remus, begging Remus to forgive him for showing up at the church, even though Remus told him not to, even though Remus told him they would get caught, even though Remus told him they had to stay secret. Throughout the night, with every additional text he sent that went unanswered, the more disconsolate he became. Eventually, he crept into his father's study to find his top-shelf liquor, and there was plenty of it. Another text, another drink. No reply, another drink. Another apology, another drink. No answer, another drink. One last text, sent just before dawn, and it was probably riddled with typos, but what it was meant to say was, "I hope you know I never meant to ruin your life. I just couldn't stay away from you. This week spent with you was the best I've ever had." Like all the ones before it, this one also went without response. The howling ache in Sirius's chest widened with the silence. Long after that text went without reply, Sirius buried himself within Regulus's bed, though it wasn't really Reg's bed, was it? And got about an hour of sleep before he was unwillingly awoken by the creaking of wood floors, and the opening and closing of doors, and the clanking of dishware, and the nondescript buzz of distant conversations. In the disorienting haze between being too drunk and not quite hungover, Sirius stumbled to the door of Regulus's bedroom to find the source of all the noise. Of course, there were people in his mother's house, just like he'd predicted. He could see the masses of their black and gray funeral attire swarming underneath the banisters of the stairs. From what he could tell through the blur in his vision and the ache in his head, most of them were family, which he expected, because his mother spent particular time on convincing the blood relatives that she was perfect, likely so she could secure her status as the matriarch of the family to win power and money. From the first floor landing, Sirius could see a long table at the other end of the main hall that surely had enough food to feed hundreds of people, catered but staged to look like Walburga had slaved over it all night and into the dawn, despite the fact that there were only a few dozen people downstairs. And they were all talking. All of them. Talking over each other, calling to each other from across the bloody room. Everyone trying to one-up everyone else. All of them trying to pretend to be someone that they weren't, the way Remus had to pretend to be someone else to please his grandfather and his congregation and the Catholic Church. Sirius was so tired of everyone pretending. In his exhaustion and grief and bitterness and drunkenness, Sirius stormed down the stairs, nearly stumbling in his dizziness right into the broad chest of Rodolphus Lestrange, Bella's husband, who, on more than one occasion, tried to get Sirius to come work for him because he said that Sirius was wasting his life on a tiny rock music publication that nobody even reads, and Sirius had hated him ever since. "Ugh, Sirius, do something with yourself," Bellatrix gagged, making a dreadful face as she looked down at what Sirius was wearing. What was he wearing? He hadn't even realized he'd changed out of his black suit last night. Blinking furiously, he pulled at the shirt hanging on his thin frame to discover it was one of Regulus's old shirts. A baggy white t-shirt with a hole at the collar that was so wide Sirius could fit his whole hand through it, an unnecessary window to the gauntness of Sirius's pale collarbone. Hanging loosely from his hips were a pair of leather gray joggers with a hole in the knee, frayed elastic at the waist, and a burst seam in the crotch, giving everyone a lovely view of his black boxer briefs. "Fuck you. These were Reggie's," he slurred, adjusting the shirt on his shoulders. "Regulus wouldn't have been caught dead in that," Bella argued snidely, knowing exactly how she'd worded that because there was a snarky grin on her face, like she'd won a fight in which Sirius hadn't even agreed to participate in the first place. With a snarl and bared teeth, Sirius snapped. "You're right. Regulus wouldn't have won this by choice. But this is what he was given by our father when he asked for new clothes, because dear old Dad told him he wasn't fit enough to wear anything else, and that he could stand to lose a few pounds at 13. He barked, teeth cracking under the strain of his ferocity. And that was after he'd been hospitalized for fatigue because of his eating disorder just a few months earlier. So, fuck you and fuck my father. Bellatrix gasped dramatically. "Sirius!" he heard his mother hissing, just before she used the point of her perfectly manicured nails to stab into the soft tissue at the crest of his ear. "You are making a scene!" He winced slightly. "You know what?" he mumbled, tearing from her grasp. "Fuck you, too." Without a slice of hesitation, Walburga reached out and took him by the face, her nails digging dimples into his cheeks. "Go sober up and put on your suit this instant," she demanded, against the annoying wriggling of Sirius trying to feebly get out of her hold. "If you are not in the pew next to me at noon, I will have your friend at the church removed for immoral behavior with a male member of his congregation." In his surprise, Sirius looked over with a widened, violent gaze. "Oh, don't think that Father Albus didn't tell me all about your serenade last night. And if you don't stay away from him, I'll make sure he stays away from you," she threatened, forcibly releasing him from her grip and shoving him back towards the stairs. "You bit," he began to say, but Walburga interrupted, silver eyes blinked out to white. "Careful what you say to me, Sirius. You of all people should know I do not make idle threats." A hard, painful swallow moved down his throat as he thought back on all the threats his mother had followed through with over the years. Putting him into Catholic school when he wouldn't behave at a young age. Arranging for Mr. Potter to get a job transfer in a different town when Sirius wouldn't stop sneaking out to go spend time with James. Starving him when she found out he was sneaking food to Reg. With a loud, angry growl of helplessness, Sirius did anything except what he was told, instead choosing to storm out the front door, pushing through the people who were in his way. Though his head had begun to clear, he still stumbled down the pavement, lucky that the church was close, lucky that it was an overcast day because he had run out of the house in naught but his bare feet. He'd left his car parked at the church because he was fully intending to take care of this once the funeral was over and the mourners had gone to the gravesite, because Sirius never intended to go, despite how he would love to throw a handful of dirt onto his father's casket to bury him that much more quickly. But his mother's phony grief and plastic life and insidious threats had him seething with fury. As Sirius strode by the open doors of the church, Mary caught a glimpse of him from where she was positioning flowers and setting out the funeral programs that Remus had designed. On her face was clear confusion, likely at Sirius's sudden presence, but also in his appearance. Still wearing the heather gray joggers with the hole in the crotch and the loose white t-shirt with the hole in the collar. "Sirius, are you all right?" Mary asked in concern, crossing the car park so she could walk beside him, keeping up with the fury in his pace. He stopped in front of his car, fumbling with the keys in his pocket, and before he could press the unlock button on his key fob, the keys tumbled to the concrete. "Yeah, I'm fucking perfect," he replied with a low growl, burying his face in his hands instead of dropping to pick up the offending keys. He could hear them jingle as Mary retrieved them. "Did something happen?" she asked cautiously, taking one hand from his face and pulling it down, carefully uncurling his fist with her fingers so that she could gently press his keyring into his palm. "Maybe you should ask Remus about that," Sirius replied bitterly, throwing himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door with only a glance of apology to Mary. In the short drive back to his mother's house, Sirius opened the automatic sunroof on his car, with a clear plan in mind. Once at his mother's house, he roared into the drive, through the main gate, and drove directly through the front lawn, destroying her well-manicured turf and uprooting several of the rose bushes that lined the house. At the commotion, guests began streaming from the house, his mother along them. "Sirius Orion Black, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, but Sirius just snarled at her, an expression that left several of her guests taking a step back to get out of his way. "I'm taking the rest of Reg's things before you start setting them all on fire to spite me." He spat angrily, moving up the stairs in a flash as most people scrambled to move from his path. "Stop this at once!" she demanded under her breath, vibrating with the volume of anger she was suppressing, evident in the silver flare of her glare. Sirius returned one of his own. "You want to tell them, or should I?" Sirius threatened through stiffly clenched teeth before he disappeared into Regulus's room, stomping across the creaking wooden floor to throw open the window. Leaning out of it for a split second, it was clear that Walburga had only followed him up to try and corral people back downstairs to prevent the spectacle. "Since we're regressing to trading threats and all." "You keep your filthy mouth shut!" Walburga spat in his direction, and Sirius was delighted to see them murmuring in the people who had followed them upstairs, while Walburga tried to shut the door. "Surely some of these people know that you and Dad are the reason Reg is dead, right?" he said, just loud enough for Walburga and the people still peering through the crack in the door to hear. A few audible murmurs moved through the onlookers as Sirius victoriously grabbed an armful of Regulus's clothes so that he could throw them out of the window, directly down into the open sunroof of his car, only a few tumbling off into the wet grass. Finally, Walburga managed to close and lock the bedroom door. "How dare you make such unfounded accusations?" she said loudly, trying to counteract the damage that had already been done, to argue for the sake of those who had already heard it. "You want to make threats? I'll make a fucking threat," Sirius said with vengeance in his voice as he went still, glowering at his mother with fire in his gaze. "You bring Remus into this, and I will tell everyone you know that you bullied your son to his death," he continued, speaking through his teeth in a tone so deep and so violent that even he didn't recognize it. At the sight of his mother looking petrified, a manic sort of laugh belted through his clenched jaw as he brutally pushed the hair from his face before diving into Reg's wardrobe again, doubling back with more clothes. "And I kept all the receipts. Proof of how we went for days without proper meals, how we were forced to sleep in the attic, how you both physically and verbally abused us on a daily, if not hourly, basis." Walburga cut him off quickly. "What do you want? Money? Is that what this is about? You want your name back in the will?" A scoff of disbelief shot out unhindered through Sirius's parted lips. "Keep your fucking money. I don't give a fuck about the fucking inheritance, or the will, or the house, or any of that horse shit." "Then what is it?" she flailed in her anger, like a child throwing a tantrum. He kept her waiting on an answer, taking his time to throw the last armful of clothes down onto his car, most making it inside. "Leave me and everyone I love the fuck alone, including Remus Lupin." Sirius stepped in close, using every centimeter of his height to intimidate her by bearing down into her face. "Don't look at him. Don't talk to him. Don't talk about him. Don't even fucking breathe in his general direction." She twisted her lips, sour in her defeat. "Make a civil appearance at the funeral, and you have a deal." She narrowed her gaze. "You do anything, say anything, out of line today, and it all becomes void." "Fine," Sirius spat, and for a split second, he almost reached out to shake on it, but realized he couldn't even stomach that much contact with her. Instead, in a flash, he went through every drawer and every cupboard and every shelf of Regulus's room to make sure nothing was left behind, conveniently forgetting to close all of those drawers and cupboards. When he was satisfied with the emptiness he was leaving behind, he gathered his black suit from the day before and threw open the bedroom door to find several eager listeners lingering, struggling to hear, silence in all corners of the house, despite its fullness. In his irritation, Sirius pushed through the crowds, each person backing away and giving him space as he passed, each one with a look of terror on their face, like he would fly off the handle and murder someone at any given moment. And really, the whim could still strike him. At the front door, he swung it open and leaned smugly on the knob. "Oh, and by the way, my parents hid it from everyone they could, for as long as they could. But I'm bent as a bed spring," he announced loudly, with a smile that was wide in its satisfaction. "Queer as a 9-bob note. Gayer than Elton John's favorite feather boa. See you at the fucking funeral, everyone." He gave himself just enough time to admire the indignation on Walburga's face before he violently slammed the door behind him. Luckily, after he stuffed all of Regulus's clothes into the back of his car and drove back to the church, Mary was gracious enough to lend her attic flat for him to change into his suit, even after he had been rather moody with her earlier. Despite how it seemed like she wanted to know the truth of what had happened between Sirius and Remus, she evidently knew not to press him to say more about it. He took as long to get dressed as he was able, in the time that he had remaining before the funeral. Stepping into his wrinkled trousers with labored movements, the heaviness of his limbs made everything feel like it took strength he didn't have. Even something as simple as looking down to fasten his trousers left his head spinning. Hand to his head, he leaned on Mary's vanity to steady himself. With a wince from the soreness in his back, he arched into his black Oxford shirt, contorting until he managed to get both arms through the sleeves. He tried to keep the pained groans from moving through his chest. That certainly wouldn't look good for Mary, for anyone to hear those sounds coming from her bedroom. But sleeping in Regulus's old bed had reminded him of the depths of how dreadfully they'd been treated as children, not even having a mattress that didn't have broken springs or places where the padding had stiffened with age. It reminded him of the sharp sense of understanding he felt when he arrived at the Potter's house that first night after he'd left home, when he realized what it was like to actually have warm food and a soft bed and people who genuinely gave a shit about him. As he buttoned the shirt, he left the top two undone, foregoing the tie he'd been wearing yesterday, afraid he might choke over anything even remotely tightening around his neck, the acidity in his throat threatening to boil up with every anxious churn of his stomach. And with a little less difficulty than he'd had with the shirt, he managed to slip into his suit jacket, loose and rumpled on his frame. To get the hair off of his neck, just in case his body decided to expel the vast amounts of liquor he'd consumed the night before, he piled it all on top of his head and secured it with the band that he always kept around his wrist, just for such an occasion. It was wildly haphazard at best, with pieces falling all around his face, a few requiring a tuck behind the ears, but he wasn't going to fight it with it further. Not like he needed to look nice to attract the attention of a handsome young priest. In fact, he wondered if Remus would be the one to say the funeral mass at all today. Maybe they had already shipped him off to another church, where he wouldn't be tempted. Maybe they had excommunicated him. Maybe Sirius would never see him again. Maybe Sirius should have spirited him away when he'd had the chance. Unwillingly, except in his will to protect Remus, Sirius took his place on the first pew, next to his mother, who thankfully refused to look over at him. His father's casket was still in the front of the pulpit, with the same crucifix that had been laying over the pall the night prior, though the church was even more packed than it had been for the prayer vigil. Sirius couldn't quite correlate those two things. Someone being well-liked enough that some 100 people showed up to their funeral, and the loathsome piece of shit that was his father. Until he realized most of these people were probably just like him. Out of the corner of his eye, Sirius caught the unmistakable color of Lily's red hair, and he glanced over to make eye contact with James. Sirius hadn't told him anything about what happened with Remus, about getting drunk arse over tit the night before his father's funeral, about the ultimatum he'd made with his mother just to make sure Remus made it through today unscathed. Apparently, it was written on Sirius's face, because James's expression took on an immediate shroud of concern. All Sirius could muster to assure James he was all right was a pathetic smile, and that only made the concern on James's face deepen. As Lily and James joined Dora and Teddy and Harry, who practically jumped from the pew into James's arms, in a back row, James shot him another glance of worry. And strangely, Seeing the uneasiness in James actually brought out a genuine smile to Sirius's face, reminded of the fact that he still had James and Lily, even if today was the last day he would ever see Remus. At that moment, a melody began to build in the wide expanse of the church, originating from the piano and sweeping broadly over the congregation. It was a song that Sirius knew, one that he was so recently reminded of through a note scribbled in cramped handwriting over aged sheet music. "Come thou, fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace," the woman sang from the pulpit, the professional singer his mother had hired so that her perfect ears wouldn't dare be subjected to an amateur on the most important day of her life. Next to Sirius, however, his mother stiffened. "This is not the song I chose," she fussed under her breath, wringing her necklace so tightly that Sirius thought she might inadvertently strangle herself. Well, one could only hope, anyway. As she muttered about the staggering level of incompetence of the church staff, Sirius listened carefully, not to his mother, but to the song. Because if his mother had specifically chose a different song for this portion of the funeral, that meant someone else chose this one, and that someone else was more than likely Remus. If Sirius knew anything about Remus, it was that he did nothing without intent. Of course, Sirius was familiar with the song, and he'd seen the sheet music hanging in that frame in Remus's bedroom, the one with the blue post-it note emphasizing what Sirius could only assume was his favorite line. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Maybe Sirius had been wrong. Maybe there was no intent behind his choice of song. Maybe this hymn carried a meaning that only Remus knew. But when the songstress started on the third verse, Sirius discovered Remus's design. "Let thy goodness, like a fetter," she sang, her voice high as she moved into the next line. "Bind my wandering heart to thee." It was a line he had seen memorialized in a beautiful, flowing script, surrounded by a wreath of ivy and jasmine, and permanently inked onto skin that was so foreign, yet so familiar. Just then, the swinging doors at the back of the church opened, and Sirius turned immediately in his anticipation. Remus was the first through the door, and his intensely amber gaze was clearly searching for Sirius the moment he moved into the nave. When their eyes met, there was a slight but meaningful rise in both of Remus's dark brows, but he left all interpretation up to Sirius, giving him no other gesture. Since all other eyes in the room were on him, including those of Father Albus, who was walking down the center aisle behind him, Remus seemed to avoid Sirius's gaze any further, eyes on the pulpit. He and Father Albus stepped onto the elevated pulpit, Father Albus moving to his left as Remus took his expected place behind the lectern. Without lifting his head towards the congregation, he let out a careful sigh before reciting a traditional prayer, making the sign of the cross as he spoke, the movement of his right hand slow and labored. "Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit." His head remained bowed, but his resinous gaze moved up over the golden frames of his glasses to meet Sirius in a burdened stare, clenching his jaw tightly before he spoke the next refrain. "As it was in the beginning, so it is now, and ever shall be, without end." He spoke slowly, methodically, emphatically, brows furrowed, refusing to break his insistent eye contact with Sirius as the congregation said Amen. Finally, with what looked like it would have been a grimace of frustration had Remus let it grow across his face, he stepped away from the lectern, and Father Albus moved forward. "A reading from the Book of Wisdom," he said in his calm but authoritative tone. As soon as he said the words, "The just man, though he died early, shall be at rest," Sirius stopped listening, visibly rolling his eyes before he looked away from Father Albus, only to find that Remus hadn't stopped looking at him, and was very clearly trying to subdue an amused smile behind his lips, pulling them into his teeth and dropping his gaze. At the end of the reading, the church said Amen. Sirius himself remained intentionally quiet, despite the angry glares from his mother, and Father Albus stepped to the side to relinquish the lectern back to Remus. Sirius didn't overlook the stern look on Father Albus's face as Remus moved forward. "My soul is thirsting for you," Remus began, noticeably leaving out the "O Lord my God" that traditionally followed the opening line of that psalm. "You are the one I seek. For you, my flesh pines, and my soul thirsts, like the earth for rain, parched, lifeless, and without water." For a briefly charged moment, Remus glanced up again, his eyes looking to Sirius alone, before they returned to a downward position as he continued reading. "For your kindness is a greater good than life." There was a pause in his recitation, his short sigh audible against the microphone. Once more, Remus looked up, but this time he lifted his chin, defiant and proud, and he flagrantly turned his head toward Sirius, meeting him in a gaze that was incendiary and unambiguous as he said, "With exultant lips, my mouth shall praise you." It seemed as if he would say more, if not for the sharp way Father Albus stepped in front of the lectern, less than gently coercing Remus to move aside. There were a few murmurs throughout the congregation, and Walburga jerked her face towards Sirius to glower at him, but his attention was on Remus, and Remus alone. Remus's eyes were drawn to the floor, but his expression was impenitent. Father Albus read another verse, though Sirius was no longer listening. He was just counting the seconds until Remus looked up at him again, silently pleading for just one more stolen glance. While Father Albus called for family and friends of the deceased to speak aloud what was on their hearts about Orion, which nobody offered to do because they were all terrified of the Black family, Sirius kept his eyes on Remus, noting how he was wearing the same funeral vestment he'd been wearing the day before. The same one that brought out the darkness and depths of his curls as they hung carelessly over his downcast face. The same one that warranted a certain ruthlessness in his gaze. The one with the gold quatrefoil pattern that lent a supplementary glimmer to the gold frames hanging precariously on the tip of his nose. For a moment, Sirius's attention was diverted as Father Albus indicated for the congregation to stand for the Lord's Prayer, followed by Holy Communion. A terrible thought moved into the forefront of his mind, and when he looked up to find Remus, he discovered that Remus was already watching him closely over the tops of his glasses, his head still bowed. The hint of a smile appeared in the corner of his lips, though he watched it away quickly, and Sirius knew he was having the very same thought. After the Eucharistic prayer, as the congregation said their amens, Father Albus swept down the steps of the pulpit, the long edges of his cassock dragging behind him. At first, it seemed as though maybe Sirius had been wrong, that Remus wouldn't be distributing the Eucharist alongside Father Albus, because he remained on the pulpit while another member of the congregation stepped up to take a chalice from the altar at the front of the nave. Sirius's dashed hopes were renewed, however, when Remus stepped down from the pulpit, politely touching the shoulder of the man and whispering something into his ear. With a smile and a nod, the man eagerly handed the chalice to Remus, the hidden smile in the corner of Remus's lips making his face look awfully pleased, while the sharp edges of his straightened back made him look violently defiant. Quickly, Sirius discovered the reason why. A chalice in his own hand, Father Albus stepped in, roughly taking the sleeve of Remus's chasuble with his free hand, and pulling Remus down so that he could reach his ear to speak to him through obviously clenched teeth. The smile on Remus's face didn't diminish in the slightest. It remained in place, even as Remus replied. As the church members were ushered into two lines to receive their communion, Sirius lingered for a moment in trying to hear what the two men were saying. There was a slight rise in Remus's voice as he replied, just enough for Sirius to hear before he moved to the back of the church, and unless he was mistaken, he heard Remus say, "This is my fucking church. I'll do what I please in it." The smile on Sirius's face as he stepped in line to receive communion, specifically from Remus, was tremendous. A few people refrained from taking communion, James, Lily, Dora, and the boys among them, so there were only a few people ahead of Sirius, giving him just enough time to work himself into a nervous fit before reaching Remus. Should he take it by hand or by tongue? Of course, all his life his mother had indoctrinated him into believing that it was practically sacrilegious to accept the Eucharist by hand, not to mention the fact that he hadn't participated in communion in over 15 years. Surely, in a religion that dated several millennia, the customs wouldn't have changed all that much in the last decade or so. Still, there were a couple of people ahead of him who were doing just that, their left hand over their right as they received it. That would be best, Sirius decided, especially with all the tension that was bound to be between the two of them. It might put Remus in an awkward position, standing next to Father Albus and all. Right, yes, he would receive the Eucharist by hand. It made the most sense, despite how Sirius had built up an entire fantasy in his head about the way Remus would place it on his tongue. As the person ahead of him stepped off to the side, Sirius was, for the first time in more than 12 hours, face to face with Remus Lupin. Whatever expression had been on Remus's face prior to that moment suddenly melted away, and he seemed almost relieved that Sirius was standing in front of him. When Sirius moved forward, he instinctively began to place his hands out in front of him, aware of the way Father Albus was watching every move he made. But when he looked up into Remus's face, Remus playfully narrowed his gaze, giving a subtle shake of his head. Sirius let his hands fall away. "Forgive me, Father," Sirius whispered, earning a sharp rise in Remus's dark brow, the one with the scar running through it. "I have committed a mortal sin by deliberately engaging in impure thoughts." The look on Remus's face was sinful. "Open your mouth, and I'll absolve you," he said with a particular lilt, keeping his tone low and willful. "If it happens again, I'll make you get on your knees." A heavy breath moved through Sirius's nostrils as he licked his lips to part them slightly, not nearly giving Remus enough space to place anything between them. With the Eucharist between his thumb and forefinger, Remus let the backs of his knuckles brush against the exterior of Sirius's lips, coaxing them to open further. With a devilish smirk, Sirius obeyed, letting his tongue move forward just enough to contact Remus's fingertips as Remus reverently placed the Eucharist upon it. He tasted like secondhand nicotine. "The body of Christ," Remus said designedly, putting pointed emphasis on the last word, using it more as an exclamation, while his own mouth absently hung open as he watched Sirius taste him. "Amen," Sirius agreed in earnest, a muffled growl moving through his throat. From Sirius's left, Father Albus was trying to stare holes through Sirius's skull. Sirius blatantly ignored the attention. Taking the chalice into both hands, Remus held it in front of Sirius's face, and instead of letting Sirius fully take it from him, he held it so that Sirius placed his hands on top of Remus's own. As Sirius sipped the wine from the chalice, he felt Remus's fingertips ghost fondly underneath his chin. "The blood of Christ," Remus recited the second half of the mantra, his eyes unjustifiably focused on the movement of Sirius's throat as he swallowed a greedy mouthful of sacramental wine. "Amen," Sirius repeated, letting his mouth hang wide as he swept his thumb underneath his bottom lip, as if to wipe away any drops of wine. Remus's eyes followed the whole motion fluidly. And then, before Sirius was ready to let it be, their isolated moment was over. They shared a disappointed smile, and Sirius returned to the pew, throwing himself into the empty place next to his mother. She gave him a glare of warning, flickering with irritation. He rolled his eyes in return. After the last of the congregation was seated, there was a brief exchange between Father Albus and Remus in front of the altar. To Sirius's surprise, Father Albus moved to sit in one of the front pews, looking at Remus with a glare very similar to the one Sirius just saw in his mother's face. Remus returned to the pulpit, shuffling some pages before shooting an unreadable expression towards Sirius. With a deep breath and that defiant rise of his chin, Remus held onto both sides of the lectern, leaning into the mic. "Orion Black was a good man to men who were good to him," Remus stated clearly, that same opening line that he and Sirius had written several nights before. By the way Father Albus seemed to stiffen in his pew, Sirius knew this was not the eulogy he'd been expecting. "If anyone was unlucky enough to have crossed Orion, God help them, because he would then be the only one who could." A few murmurs moved through the crowd, a few awkward laughs, a few hums of agreement, as if nobody could quite decide on how to interpret that line. As Sirius glanced around, he was deeply unsettled to find the police officer that had nearly assaulted Remus the night they first met sitting very near the front row, laughing innocently. The man watched Remus with a fond smile, as if he wouldn't have done Remus real, physical harm for no other reason than the color of his skin. And he would have if Remus had been anyone else, if Sirius hadn't mentioned Orion, if that man hadn't found out that Remus was the priest of his church. But Remus didn't see him. Remus continued without looking up at anyone. Orion was a devout Catholic all his life, giving more money to the church in a single tithe than most people earn in a year. Though, I'm sure most of you already know that, since he enjoyed telling that to people directly. Remus said with a very false, very wide grin. Most of the congregation laughed. Hell, even his mother let out an unwilling laugh. But Father Albus clearly understood the intent. Joined with us this afternoon is Orion's wife of nearly 40 years, Walburga Black. The church members clapped as Walburga stood, totally unprompted, and bowed like a fucking celebrity. She stood by Orion through good times and bad, through rumors and truths, through faithfulness and infidelity, through the many illnesses and injuries of their two frail children, and through a string of financial failures, though it should be noted that she stayed with her brother Cygnus during that difficult period. A wave of laughter moved through the church, as if Remus had told a joke, and it obscured the fact that Remus had blatantly stated that Orion had been unfaithful to his wife. Even Walburga had to give a showy laugh to prove she was a good sport, but her manicured fingers were digging sharply into her handbag. We're also honored to have Orion's oldest son, Sirius, with us in the congregation for the first time in 15 years. Remus announced with a soft smile before he added, Orion did everything in his power to make sure Sirius followed in his footsteps, though we all know how well that worked out. More laughter, people glancing over at him hoping to see anger on his expression. But truly, Sirius could think of no greater compliment than the fact that he turned out nothing like his father. Not to mention, he was the one who came up with that line. I'm sure Orion wished that the God of the Old Testament would strike Sirius down for his sinful ways. But when that obviously didn't work, Orion did his very best to strike Sirius down by his own hand. If Sirius hadn't been expecting it, he would have been enraged over the way people laughed at that statement, as if Orion beating his own children was a source of their entertainment. Of course, as we all know, Orion was preceded in death by his youngest son, Regulus. Remus said with a solemn expression and a weighted tone. One of his mother's acrylic nails chipped from the way her grip instantly tightened on her designer leather handbag, clearly unsettled by the uncertainty of what Remus would divulge about the manner of Regulus's death. Orion loved Regulus the way Abraham loved Isaac, willing to offer his perfect son as a sacrifice to secure his place in God's kingdom. An unnerving silence filled the church as people tried to determine the meaning and purpose behind Remus's metaphor. Undisturbed by the silence, Remus continued. So pious in his faith, Orion wanted to ensure that his beloved sons followed the law of God precisely the way he did, lest they be lost to eternal damnation, despite the fact that he was actively inspiring one of them to take that very route. This time, the silence was drowned out by the buzz of fervent whispering. Every voice in the church turned to the person sitting next to them to ask the same phrase. Did he just say what I think he said? It was clear that Father Albus was having a crisis in his seat, trying to decide if he should intervene and risk causing a scene, or hope that the audience was too stupid to figure out what Remus was heavily implying. After taking a meaningful pause to let the confused whispering disperse and carry and grow, Remus continued, encouraged by the fact that Father Albus didn't jump up to stop him. However, I am here to tell you that taking one's life in a moment of misery and despair due to the inescapable circumstances of one's birth cannot be unforgivable to a God who is supposed to be compassionate and unfailing and kind. Remus emphasized deeply, holding his hand to his chest, a look of profound conviction on his face. Contrary to what you've been led to believe, faith is not paying more tithe than anyone else. Faith is not securing your seat in the front pew so that you're seen as better than those who silently slip into the back. With this thought, he directed his wrathful gaze towards Walburga, lingering long enough so that there was no ambiguity. Once his point was made, he redirected his stare downward for a moment, as Sirius began to realize that these were words they hadn't written together. These were Remus's words alone. As he continued, Sirius listened with rapturous focus. Faith is a shout into the dark, Remus said, his voice suddenly thick and troubled. It is a grief-stricken, gut-wrenching scream of agony into an otherwise endless void. It is a desperate cry for help, to someone that you can only hope is out there, that you can only hope is listening to you. He paused, taking in an unsteady breath as he found Sirius's tear-filled gaze and held it resolutely. Faith is a soft sob of, I don't want to live here anymore. Can I come and stay with you? That is swiftly answered with a resounding and enthusiastic response of course you can. You don't even need to ask. Remus said with a heavy swallow, wrinkling his nose as he appeared to try and stave off the tears that Sirius was not even trying to choke back. Tears that had long since spilled over his cheeks as he considered the possibility that maybe Regulus wasn't with him anymore, but maybe Reg wasn't alone anymore either. With a great, difficult breath, as he watched the tears roll unhindered down Sirius's face, Remus closed out his thought. And if the people of this church believe in a God that was a saving place for someone like Orion, but not Regulus. He paused, tightly clenching his teeth. Then we believe in very different deities. The murmuring intensified, and Father Albus began to rise from his place to put an end to Remus's heretical rant, but Remus stopped him first. Bow your heads for a word of prayer, he commanded in a strong voice, and the congregation obeyed. Father Albus was forced to choose between disrupting prayer or remaining in place. He chose the latter, keeping his hands clasped tightly behind his back. With every head bowed, Remus used the new silence and inattention to look over and bestow upon Sirius the warmest, most genuine smile Sirius had ever received in his life. He didn't bow his head as he spoke aloud the prayer. Instead, he held Sirius's gaze. Father in heaven, grant in us a love so abundant that we have no choice but to share it with everyone around us, a compassion so deep that we forgive others for the same countless failures that you forgive in us. He blinked slowly, letting out a careful but contented sigh into the microphone. In peace, as we bring Orion to his place of final rest, may you also provide rest to those who truly knew him, those for whom the sting of his death is not nearly so sharp. Amen, Sirius replied in a whisper heard only to himself, watching as Remus let a smile of relief wash over his features. Remus repeated the expression aloud, and the congregation said it back to him. With a soft bow, Remus stepped away from the lectern as the woman leading the songs moved in to take his place, the pianist taking a seat on the same bench where he and Remus had been caught together the night before. The hymn that began was clearly another that Remus had chosen, another one of those old sheets of music he had framed in his bedroom, decorated with an emphatic post-it note. This is my father's world. Why should my heart be sad? The songstress crooned as the pallbearers carried the casket down the center aisle, followed closely by his mother and his 3 cousins, but Sirius didn't go with them. Instead, he looked back for Remus, hoping to see the look on his face as the lyric he'd written on that note in his bedroom was sung aloud, but Remus wasn't in sight. Idly, Sirius leaned around the lectern, looking to see if Remus was still on the pulpit, and when he didn't find Remus there, he went wandering towards the piano. There was a side door at the pulpit, the same door that Sirius had seen Remus walk out the first time he'd seen Remus in his religious vestments. It was open just enough for Sirius to see inside from where he stood in front of the pulpit steps. Inside the room, Remus was facing him. Well, Remus was facing Father Albus, but Remus towered over the older man, so there was nothing obstructing the view of Remus's face. The look Sirius found there was abject defiance. Jaw clenched, shoulders thrown back, amber eyes on fire. "It has already been decided," Father Albus stated, though Sirius strained to hear it. "I will lead the church in the interim until a permanent decision is made. You will remain here as my curate." "So, they'll relinquish control of my church over to someone who fathered an illegitimate child with a woman of his congregation, a woman who is married to his head deacon, rather than let a gay man lead it. That sounds about right," Remus ranted, chewing furiously at his bottom lip, not having noticed Sirius. Father Albus continued, unruffled. "It is simply a probationary period. If you stay in line and you refrain from pulling another stunt like you did today, Bishop Crouch will repeal the decision." That didn't seem to pacify Remus in the least, and Father Albus made it worse by heaping fuel onto an already raging fire. "Whether you realize it or not, the tithe given by Orion and Walburga is what pays your salary." "I don't give a fuck," Remus nearly shouted, laughing maniacally. "Orion Black was a piece of shit who abused his youngest to death. Do you get that? Do you not see the harm it does putting someone like that on a church-sanctioned pedestal just because he gives us a fuck ton of money?" "Watch your language, son." "I am not your fucking son," he said, his voice finally breaking into a shout. It fizzled out into a bitter, frantic laugh. "I am the son of Lyle Lupin, a man you relentlessly bullied for having dark skin, for being Hindu, for falling in love with your daughter, for having me outside of marriage, which, by the way, is the same fucking thing you did, except you had the church to cover it up for you." His laugh continued, sounding unhinged and broken. "I don't know why I've spent all these years listening to you." "Are you really willing to risk everything you've worked for, everything you have, for a man like Sirius Black?" Father Albus condescended. Remus's jaw immediately went tight. "He will inevitably grow bored of you, and you will be left with nothing." Sirius went absolutely still, knowing that Father Albus was wrong, invariably wrong, but afraid Remus might agree. "Are you willing to give up your home, your career, your life, for someone like that?" Father Albus asked sharply. Remus spoke before he finished. "Yes," Remus answered, without a pause and without question. A nearly inaudible breath moved from Sirius's lips as he watched Remus cock his head angrily to one side, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension in them. But that nearly inaudible breath still made enough sound to attract Remus's violent amber gaze, falling on Sirius from over Father Albus's shoulder, and he met Sirius's gaze steadfastly. At first, Sirius let himself smile, though that smile was filled with a sadness he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. Remus furrowed his brows at Sirius's expression. For a moment, Father Albus was silent. "Stay away from Sirius Black, or lose your ordination. The choice is yours. I suggest you take some time to think before making any rash decisions." As Father Albus let his hand rest atop Remus's shoulder, and Remus swatted it away, Sirius held on to that smile as he turned to leave. Before he could walk out of the church doors for the last time, he heard Remus's voice ring out over the sudden silence of the empty nave. "Sirius," he called, standing at the altar. Sirius didn't turn. "I think we knew this was a delusion, Remus," Sirius said back still turned. "Your granddad was exactly right. I'd probably get what I wanted from you and toss you aside." He swallowed heavily. "Don't do that," Remus argued, voice steady and sure, but with an underlying growl of irritation, likely from the conversation he'd just had with his grandfather. "Don't talk to me like I don't know you." "You don't know me," Sirius snapped, turning his head just enough to glance at Remus through his periphery. "You've only known me for a week, and I spent that whole week consistently trying to get you into bed. Or did you forget that?" An indignant laugh of disbelief moved through Remus's lips. "Did you forget?" Remus replied, his voice sharp and distressed. About the day we spent with Harry and Teddy? About what I said to you that night? His voice lowered as he continued, making it harder for Sirius to leave. Did you forget about how you showed up in the middle of the night to tell me you didn't want anyone else but me? How we stayed up until dawn to write that stupid eulogy, but instead we spent the whole night talking and crying, and you... He stopped as his voice broke, and the tears in Sirius's eyes were instant. And you're telling me I don't know you? He asked in a voice that was more fragile than Sirius had ever wanted to hear it. Don't let my grandfather dictate this. He has dictated it, Sirius barked, refusing to turn to face Remus fully, because he was afraid that his will would waver when he saw the despair in Remus's face. He blinked back the tears to say, He's given you an ultimatum, your whole life, or me, and I'm going to make sure you make the right choice by taking one of them away from you. Straightening his back, he moved to the door with laden steps. The empty way that Remus said his name was almost enough to make him turn back, but not quite. If walking away from Remus had been the hardest thing he'd ever had to do, the second hardest was not going to the Hollyhead show that night. James and Lily had done their best to try and convince him to go with them. Fidelius was still playing, after all, but his mind hadn't been changed. It didn't help that Remus, or Mooney for that matter, hadn't texted him all evening. If anything, it strengthened his resolve, because Remus was probably finally recognizing that Sirius was right. This never could have worked, even if they had tried to keep it a secret. It would have gone down in holy flames. All evening, Sirius sat at home alone, rather, at James and Lily's flat. Why did he even still keep his own flat? And played sad songs in the dark. When The Sun and the Moon by May came on, Sirius had skipped it immediately. It was hard to believe only 24 hours had passed since then. As soon as he heard keys jangling outside the front door, Sirius was in front of it, waiting for James and Lily to walk through it. Just because he wasn't allowing himself to see Remus directly didn't mean he didn't want to get all the indirect details about him from James and Lily. Was he wearing the mask? Which sunglasses? What did his ironic t-shirt say? What color was his plaid overshirt? Were there holes in the knees of his jeans? As soon as James opened the door, it seemed like these questions all tumbled out of Sirius's mouth at once, in an unintelligible heap, and James gave him a strange look. But the strange look lingered. In fact, he glanced back to share it with Lily, and the look on Lily's face was the same, but stranger, almost like they were nervous. Worried? Concerned? What was it? What's going on? Sirius finally asked, eyes darting between the two of them. James swallowed. Sirius, I think you should sit down. Was he not there? Sirius pressed, slowly following James's request as he sat down onto their sofa. With a sigh through her nostrils as she worried her bottom lip, Lily sat down next to him. He wasn't there, she confirmed, settling a placating hand on top of Sirius's knee. Oh, this was bad. We heard Hollyhead broke up, James stated quickly, letting out a full breath as he spoke. Oh, Sirius let out a breath too. That could only mean one thing. Remus's grandfather won. His ultimatum had been too heavy for Remus, and Remus had given into it, which meant that Sirius really never was going to see him again. Not as Father Lupin, not as Mooney, not as anyone, not ever. I think you should text him, Lily suggested, urging in her voice, her hand moving from his knee to take his fingers lightly into her own. James mirrored her action on the other side. Sirius gave them both a sad smile. No, if... He paused to pull in a breath, then restarting. If this is what Remus wants, then I shouldn't try to change his mind. He squeezed both their hands. You didn't see how hard this whole thing was on him. It's better that he chose this. It'll be easier this way. Sirius, James said insistently, placing his other hand atop Sirius's forearm. Doesn't mean it doesn't suck, though. He laughed, though it barely had time to move through his teeth before it fettered out into nothing more than a thickness in the air. Listen, I'm going to go in my room now because I think I might cry a little bit, but if you could just stay and pretend like I'm not crying, that would be a great help to my ego. This laugh was a little more genuine, but James and Lily still didn't let go of his hands. If anything, both their grips increased as Sirius moved towards the edge of the sofa. "Don't go," Lily urged him. "Stay. I'll put on Pushing Daisies." Finally, the laugh that was expelled from his throat was loud and boisterous in full. Leave it to Lily to get him to laugh when he felt like this. "I appreciate the offer, but maybe we can save Lee Pace for tomorrow?" he bargained. James nodded, patting his arm. "Tomorrow we can watch The Fall and Possession. Hell, the whole Hobbit trilogy. His whole fucking filmography, if you want," he said, letting go of Sirius's hand, only so he could place it onto Sirius's face, pulling him close so that James could press a kiss to his temple. "I love you both so much," Sirius said with a sigh that was both sad and contented. "We love you just the same," Lily said, pressing a mirrored kiss to Sirius's opposite temple. "I'll see you in the morning," Sirius nodded, moving from the sofa. "Tomorrow will be better." "And if it's not, we'll make it that way," James said defiantly, as Lily nodded in fervent agreement. As Sirius shut the door behind him and turned on the lights for the first time that evening, he realized he'd been lying on the stupid funeral program all night, having apparently set it on top of his mattress before turning on his music. Just before he'd left the church, Mary had handed it to him with a peculiar look in her eye, telling him what a great job Remus had done making it. Through the entire Mass service, he'd been so focused on Remus that he hadn't picked one up. Hell, he still hadn't looked at it. And Mary was right. It was very well put together. The photos that Sirius had chosen were displayed on every side of the paper, an unflattering photo of Orion everywhere the eye fell. It gave Sirius one last smile. He wondered if he should keep it, if for no other reason than Remus had made it. As he went to fold it again, his eye caught something in the center. It was a program, after all, so it had the order of events for the funeral mass. Next to each one was the person responsible for that portion of the program. The woman who had sung the songs had her name there. Father Albus's name was there for the Lord's Prayer, and across from the line that read "Delivery of Eulogy" was a name, a full name, not just first and last. It included his middle name, John, Remus John Lupin. That was the name Marlene had given him that night. When Sirius had asked her for Mooney's real name, she told him Mooney's name was John. His name was John, and he was a teacher. And what is a priest but the teacher of a single ancient book? This was Remus's final sign. He really was Mooney. And now, Sirius couldn't have him under either name. It only added more weight to the news of Holyhead's breakup, knowing that Remus had to give up one of his favorite pastimes just to please his curmudgeonly grandfather. How far would Remus go to make him happy when he was so unworthy of it? It didn't matter. Sirius wasn't allowed to be in Remus's life anymore. It was the right decision, of course, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. Sirius hadn't even really given himself the time or the attention to say goodbye to Remus. Not properly. He'd been trying too hard to make Remus hate him. The whole thing sparked an idea in Sirius's mind. Maybe he couldn't see Remus. Maybe he couldn't text him, but he could send him one last message. A message that only Remus would understand. A message that told Remus that Sirius had seen him for who he truly was. That Sirius had found all of the breadcrumbs Remus left him. It might be the last message he'd ever send to Remus. Quickly, he pulled his laptop from his bag and settled onto his bed, folding his legs underneath him. He typed in a fury, typing and deleting, reading and rewording and editing and reading again, until the message would be clear to Remus. He sent 3 emergency texts, one to his copy editor, one to his art director, and the last to his publisher. He had a last-minute addition to tomorrow's edition. He wanted to throw in an editorial piece, and his first ever editorial would read, "Local band pick of the week. Holyhead out of the dirty suburbs of London. The fiery blonde female lead is more proficient on guitar and vocals simultaneously than most veterans are at either one alone. Backed by a drummer with not only the tightest braids in town, but the tightest rhythms and the sickest sticks tricks. Their mysterious bass player, who remains nameless by intention, stabilizes their melodies through the same channels he unravels them, ensuring they remain tight in their timing, but feral and rough in their delivery, making Holy Heads a paradox to hear. Using a metaphor that could only suit a band who uses religious imagery against its labeled purpose, Marlene is the Messiah, a long-awaited savior who delivers the souls of the damned with angelic vocals and a brutal crucifixion on her fingers against the strings. Dorcas is the prophet, leading in the arrival of the second coming with apocalyptic-level drum rolls that could only signal the end of times, as there can be no other who could dare compete with her immense level of honed skill and raw talent. And finally, their nameless bassist is the priest, and you had better get on your knees and bow your unworthy head before the glory of his immaculate bass lines, a gift of divinity bestowed upon him by God himself that leaves you breathlessly begging, "Bless me, Father."